The rhythmic, low-pitched rumble of a Greyhound bus engine has a way of crawling inside your bones if you sit over the rear axle long enough. It's a heavy metallic vibration that rattles against your teeth and hums a steady hypnotic drone through the soles of your shoes. For 16 hours, that sound had been my only constant companion. Outside the scratched double-paned window, the warm, moss-draped romance of Savannah, Georgia, had long since dissolved into the bleak, industrialized gray of the Northeast Corridor. It was mid-February. The world outside looked frozen, drained of color, captured in endless shades of asphalt and dirty slush. Every mile north felt like a step further away from the soil that knew my name. My name is Ruby Vance. I am 62 years old. For 22 of those years, I wore the faded blue scrubs of a certified nursing assistant at the Whispering Pines Senior Care Facility back home. 20 years of lifting heavy bodies, changing soiled linens, and holding the hands of dying folks, while the rest of the world slept soundly on the night shift. My hands tell the story of my life. They are calloused, rough around the edges, with knuckles that ache when the rain rolls in from the Atlantic. My skin is the color of dark molasses, lined with the quiet geometry of a woman who has smiled through 1,000 storms and wept only when the kitchen door was shut. But on that bus, despite the exhaustion pulling at the corners of my eyes, my hands were wrapped tightly around something soft, something precious. In my lap rested a heavy hand-stitched quilt. It was a patchwork of vibrant oranges, deep navy blues, and warm mustard yellows. A scrap quilt made from the leftover cotton of old shirts, Sunday dresses, and a few precious square inches of a tiny denim overall that my son Marcus used to wear when he was barely big enough to chase the pigeons in Forsyth Park. Every stitch was a prayer I had whispered over the last 9 months. Every knot was a promise made to a little boy I hadn't yet seen, but already loved with a fierce, terrifying intensity. My grandson, Matthew. "You heading all the way to Port Authority, ma'am?" The voice belonged to the young man sitting across the aisle. He had been chewing on a plastic toothpick for 3 states, his ears plugged into tinny headphones that leaked the distant aggressive thud of modern bass. I turned my head slowly, offering him the polite, measured smile of a Southern woman raised to never treat a stranger like an inconvenience. "Yes, son. All the way to New York. Got family up there. My son," I said. And just pronouncing the word brought a familiar, stubborn warmth to my chest. "He's an architect in Manhattan. His wife is in labor right now at St. Luke's. I'm going to meet my grandbaby." The boy looked at the heavy quilt in my arms, then at my worn leather purse, and nodded with a sudden, unexpected flash of respect. "That's a long ride for a newborn. Safe travels, ma'am." "Thank you, son." I looked back out the window as the bus lurched forward, navigating the choked lanes of the New Jersey Turnpike. A long ride. He didn't know the half of it. It wasn't just a 16-hour bus ticket. It was a 32-year journey. When Marcus's father, Big Marcus, collapsed on the dock of the Savannah shipping yard with a massive stroke, my boy was only 15. He was a skinny child with wide, observant eyes and a habit of sketching buildings on the back of brown paper grocery bags. The night his father died, Marcus didn't cry. He just sat at the small linoleum kitchen table, holding a broken piece of charcoal, drawing the same bridge over and over again until the paper tore through. I looked at him that night, my heart shattered into 1,000,000 pieces, and I made a silent covenant with the Almighty. I will be the floorboards beneath his feet, I promised. I will be the walls that keep the wind off his back. And I was. I took on the double shifts at the nursing home. I cleaned the teeth of wealthy folks' offices downtown in the early afternoons before my regular shift started. My hands permanently smelled of industrial bleach and wintergreen disinfectant. My back throbbed with a dull, white-hot heat that never truly left me. But every dollar went into a tin can behind the flour jar. Every cent was a brick in the monument I was building for my son's future. When the acceptance letter came from Howard University, A brilliant historic institution, Marcus held that paper like it was made of solid gold. "We did it, Ma," he had whispered, burying his face in my neck. His skin was hot, his shoulders shaking with the first real tears he had shed since his father passed. "You did it. I'm going to build you a house one day. A big one. With a porch that wraps all the way around so you never have to work another night shift." "You just build your dreams, Marcus," I told him, stroking his short cropped hair. "The Lord will take care of my feet." He excelled at Howard. He was a star student, a young black man with a sharp mind and a quiet, dignified ambition that made professors take notice. When he graduated, he landed a junior position at a prestigious architectural firm in New York City. I emptied the last of my savings, $3,000 I had kept under the mattress, to help him pay the security deposit on a tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn and buy his first 2 tailored suits. "Don't you go out there looking like you don't belong to somebody, Marcus Vance," I told him at the Savannah train station 3 years ago. "You carry yourself like you know exactly whose blood is running through your veins." He had promised he would, and for the first year he kept that promise. He called me every single night at exactly 9 p.m. We would talk about the noise of the subway, the price of a gallon of milk in New York, and the projects he was working on. He was my boy. He was the harvest of my life's long, bitter winter. Then came Valerie Thomas. I remember the night he first mentioned her name. His voice had a different frequency, lighter, thinner, breathless, with a kind of nervous reverence. "She's an interior designer, Ma. Her dad is a corporate attorney on Wall Street, and her mother, Dr. Evelyn Thomas, is a tenured professor of sociology at Columbia. They've got this beautiful brownstone in Harlem. Ma, they're different. They're old money New York." "Are they good people, Marcus?" I asked, my maternal instincts instantly prickling at the tone of awe in my son's voice. "They're very refined, Ma," he answered. It wasn't an answer to my question. Within 6 months, the daily phone calls became weekly. Then they became bi-weekly. When we did speak, Marcus sounded like a man walking on a tightrope, carefully choosing every word as if someone were standing over his shoulder with a clipboard evaluating his grammar. I met Valerie and her mother, Dr. Evelyn Thomas, exactly once at the wedding in New York a year ago. It was a lavish cold affair held in a glass conservatory overlooking Central Park. I had bought a lovely navy blue dress from the department store in Savannah and spent 2 hours getting my hair pressed at Miss Clara's salon before I left. I thought I looked nice. But when Dr. Evelyn Thomas looked at me across the champagne fountain, her eyes didn't see a fellow mother. They saw an anthropological specimen. She looked at my dress, her gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on my sensible, low-heeled orthotic shoes, the shoes that had survived 20 years of hospital floors. "Ah, Ruby," Evelyn had said, her voice dripping with a chilly manufactured academic warmth. "Marcus speaks so fondly of his rural roots. It must be quite a shock for you to see him in such an elevated cultural milieu." Valerie had stood beside her mother wearing a diamond necklace that could have paid off my mortgage 3 times over. She gave me a tight, painted smile that never reached her cold amber eyes. "We're just so glad you could make the trip, Mrs. Vance. Marcus was so worried the Northern Transit would confuse you." Marcus had stood between them, his face flushed, his eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood floor. He didn't defend me. He didn't take my arm. He just looked embarrassed. Like an old piece of furniture his new friends were trying to figure out how to hide in the attic. I sat in the 3rd row at that wedding. The first 2 rows were reserved for the Thomas clan, their Ivy League colleagues, and their high society associates. I sat behind a large floral arrangement that partially blocked my view of my own son's face when he said his vows. I swallowed the lump in my throat that night, telling myself that it didn't matter where I sat as long as my boy was happy, as long as he was being loved. But a mother's heart knows the difference between a child who is growing up and a child who is being erased. The Greyhound bus shuddered to a final definitive halt in the bowels of the Port Authority bus terminal. The air inside the station was thick with the smell of diesel fumes, cheap pizza, and the damp, stale odor of too many people crowded into a space without enough winter air. My joints screamed in protest as I stood up, clutching the quilt to my chest like a shield. I dragged my small, battered suitcase down the steps of the bus and stepped onto the concrete platform. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was a text from Marcus. "Let me know when you get to St. Luke's. Don't go straight to the room. Wait in the main lobby on the ground floor. No, did you have a safe trip, Ma? No, are you tired? Just a logistical instruction." I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach, but I pushed it down. This is a hospital, I told myself. The boy is nervous. He's about to be a father. I hailed a yellow cab outside the terminal. The driver was an older Haitian man who listened to a soft melodic radio station in a language I didn't know, but the rhythm was comforting. The city blurred past the rain-streaked windows, the towering glass skyscrapers of Midtown, giving way to the grand, imposing stone edifices of the Upper West Side. When the cab pulled up to St. Luke's Hospital, my hands were sweating despite the freezing wind howling off the Hudson River. I paid the driver, pulled my coat tightly around my neck, and walked through the heavy glass sliding doors into the cavernous, sterile warmth of the lobby. The smell hit me instantly, the sharp, unmistakable scent of antiseptic floor wax and latent anxiety. It was the smell of my entire adult life. For a moment I felt a strange sense of grounding. I know this place, I thought. I've spent 20 years in hallways just like this. I belong here. I found a row of vinyl chairs near a large potted ficus tree and sat down. I waited. 10 minutes turned into 20. 20 turned into 45. Every time the elevator doors dinged, my head snapped up my eyes, searching for the tall, slightly stooped shoulders of my boy. Finally, after nearly an hour, the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby slid open and Marcus stepped out. My heart leaped. "Marcus!" I called out, standing up, the heavy quilt draped over my arm. He stopped, his eyes scanning the lobby until they landed on me. He didn't run. He didn't smile. He walked toward me with a slow, heavy gait, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his expensive wool overcoat. He looked exhausted. There were dark, bruised circles under his eyes, and his hair was uncombed, but there was something else in his face. A tension. A profound, vibrating discomfort. "Ma," he said, stopping 2 feet away from me. He didn't lean in for a hug. He just nodded, his eyes darting nervously toward the security desk and then back to the floor. "Marcus, baby," I said, reaching out to touch his arm. His coat felt stiff and cold under my fingers. "How is she? How's Valerie? Has the baby come yet?" She's still in labor, Ma. It's been 20 hours. The doctor said her blood pressure is spiking. It's a whole thing." "Oh, the poor child," I said, my Etah instincts instantly taking over. 20 hours is a long road for a first-time mother. Is she dilated? Are they giving her magnesium for the pressure? I can go up there, Marcus. I know how to rub a woman's lower back when the contractions get tight. I used to help the floor nurses back in Georgia all the time. "No!" The word came out too loud, too sharp. A sharp cracking sound that made a lady sitting 3 chairs down look up from her magazine. Marcus flinched at his own tone. He took a deep breath, rubbed his face with both hands, and looked anywhere but at me. "No, Ma. You can't go up there." I felt the blood drain from my face. The heavy quilt suddenly felt like a block of lead in my arms. "What do you mean I can't go up there, Marcus? I'm his grandmother. I traveled 16 hours on a Greyhound bus to be here." Marcus swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down against the crisp white collar of his shirt. When he spoke, his voice was a low, hurried whisper, as if he were trying to pass a contraband note in a schoolroom. Valerie's doctor said she's under too much stress, Ma. Her preeclampsia is borderline. The medical team said she needs an environment that is completely familiar, completely controlled. No extra stimulation. No distractions. I stared at my son, the boy I had carried for 9 months. The boy whose fevers I had broken with cool washcloths while the savannah humidity hung like steam in our little house. "Marcus," I said, my voice dropping into that quiet, steady register I used when a patient was losing their mind from the dementia. "Look at me." He wouldn't. His eyes were locked on a small smudge of dirt on the toe of his leather boots. "Look at your mother, Marcus." Slowly, reluctantly, he raised his head. There was shame in his eyes, deep, sickly green shame, but behind that shame was a stubborn defensive wall. A wall built by someone else's hands. "Are you telling me that my face is a distraction to your wife?" I asked softly. "Are you telling me that the woman who gave you life is going to stress out that girl up there?" "Ma, you don't understand how it is up here," he muttered, his voice tightening, adopting that defensive intellectual cadence he had stolen from his mother-in-law. "Valerie has a specific birth plan. She's got a private doula. She's very particular about her space. Her mother is up there because her mother understands her medical history. She knows the family physicians. And I don't—" I cut him off, the first spark of real righteous anger flickering in my chest. "I was a CNA for 22 years, Marcus Vance. I have delivered babies in the back of pickup trucks on the red clay roads of Georgia before your wife's mother even learned how to spell sociology. Don't you dare stand there and tell me about medical history." "Ma, please," Marcus hissed, taking a step closer, his eyes darting frantically around the lobby. "Don't do this. Don't make a scene. This is exactly what Valerie was worried about. She said you'd bring all that Southern drama up here and make it about you." The words hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. I actually stepped back, my breath caught in my throat. Southern drama. Make it about you. Those weren't Marcus's words. That was the sterile, elitist vocabulary of Dr. Evelyn Thomas. It was the language of a family that viewed my entire existence, my accent, my history, my sacrifices as an uncivilized stain on their pristine, polished hardwood floors. And my son had swallowed it whole. He had let them feed it to him until he choked on it, and now he was spitting it back into my face. "Marcus," I whispered, the anger suddenly washing out of me, leaving behind a cold, hollow valley of grief. "Did you gotch 10 me? Did you take my name off the visitor list?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The way his shoulders sagged, the way his jaw clenched, it was all the confession I needed. Twist 1. He hadn't been forced by a doctor's note. He hadn't been cornered by a medical emergency. He had sat down with a pen and a piece of paper weeks ago under the watchful, judgmental eye of his mother-in-law, and he had actively, deliberately crossed his own mother out of his life. Just then, the elevator doors at the end of the hall dinged again. I looked past Marcus's shoulder. Emerging from the silver doors was Dr. Evelyn Thomas. She was dressed in a pristine, camel-colored cashmere coat, her hair perfectly coiffed, carrying a small, elegant cup of espresso from the hospital's upscale cafe. Behind her walked Valerie's younger sister, Maya, laughing quietly as she scrolled through her phone. They didn't see me at first. They walked with the effortless, arrogant confidence of people who own the building, who own the city, who own the very air they breathed. "Marcus, darling," Evelyn's voice floated across the lobby, sharp and clear. "The doctor says she's at 9 centimeters. We need to get back upstairs before—" She stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes had finally landed on me. The transition on her face was remarkable. The bright, high society smile vanished, replaced instantly by a cool, masked expression of supreme annoyance. She didn't look at my face. Her eyes went straight to my vintage Greyhound ticket sticking out of my coat pocket, and then down to the colorful homemade quilt resting on my arm. "Oh," Evelyn said, her voice dropping an octave into that polite, deadly academic register. "Ruby, We had no idea you would be arriving so unannounced." "I wasn't unannounced, Evelyn," I said, my voice steady, rising from the deep, immovable well of my Southern upbringing. "Marcus has known the date of this delivery for 9 months, and I have been sitting in this lobby for an hour." Evelyn didn't look at me when she replied. She looked at Marcus, her eyebrows raised in a silent, devastating gesture of maternal disappointment. It was the look a teacher gives a child who has brought a dirty stray dog into a clean classroom. "Marcus," Evelyn said softly, her tone laced with a heavy, patronizing pity. "I thought we discussed this. I thought you had taken care of the arrangements. Valerie is in an incredibly fragile state right now. We cannot have complications in the corridor." "I know, Evelyn. I'm handling it," Marcus said quickly, his voice high and frantic. He sounded like a dog begging for a scrap from the table. He turned back to me, his face desperate, his hand reaching out to grab my wrist. "Ma, please, just go back to the hotel. I'll call you. I promise I'll call you when it's over. Just leave the quilt and go." Leave the quilt and go. He wanted the labor of my hands. He wanted the warmth of my love to protect his child. But he didn't want the skin that carried it. He wanted to strip me of my creation and hide the creator in a cheap hotel room like a shameful secret. I looked at Evelyn. She was sipping her espresso, her eyes cold and victorious over the rim of the paper cup. I looked at Maya, who hadn't even looked up from her phone, as if my presence were completely beneath her notice. And then I looked at my son, the boy who used to hold my thumb when we walked to the grocery store because the world was too big for him. The boy who had promised me a house with a wraparound porch. He was gone. In his place stood a stranger wearing an expensive coat with a hollow chest and a broken spine, begging a wealthy woman for permission to breathe. Something inside me didn't just break, it settled. It was the same feeling I got when Big Marcus's pulse stopped beneath my fingers 32 years ago. A sudden, terrible, beautiful clarity. The storm was over. The damage was done. Now there was only the cleanup. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled my arm away from Marcus's grip. I folded the heavy patchwork quilt over my arm, aligning the edges perfectly precisely the way I used to fold the linens at the nursing home. "No, Marcus," I said. My voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear. It was resonant. It carried the weight of every night shift, every mile of that 16-hour bus ride, and every drop of sweat I had ever spilled for him. "I won't be leaving the quilt." Marcus blinked, confused. "Ma, and I won't be going to a hotel." I continued, looking him directly in his shameful, shifting eyes. "I am going back to Savannah, on the very next bus." "Ma, don't be like that," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You're being unreasonable. It's just for a few days until Valerie calms down." "Goodbye, Marcus," I said. I didn't look at Evelyn. I didn't look at Maya. I turned my back on the three of them, my worn leather purse tucked firmly under my arm, my suitcase rolling smoothly behind me. As I walked toward the heavy glass sliding doors of St. Luke's Hospital, the automatic sensors triggered, and the freezing February wind hit my face like a slap of pure cold reality. I didn't flinch. I stepped out onto the snowy sidewalk of New York City, the doors closing behind me with a soft, definitive whoosh. Behind those doors, the distant muffled sound of a newborn baby's first cry echoed into the sterile corridor. My grandson had entered the world, and I was standing on the outside, a stranger in the cold. The 16 hours back down to Savannah were not like the 16 hours up. On the ride north, the engine had hummed with anticipation, each vibration a heartbeat counting down to the moment I would hold Marcus's boy. On the ride south, the Greyhound felt like a rolling tin coffin, the tires grinding against the blacktop with a monotonous, mocking rhythm. I didn't cry. Tears are a luxury for people who still believe things can be fixed by weeping. I just sat there staring at my own reflection in the fogged window, the hand-stitched quilt sitting like a dead weight on the empty seat beside me. When I finally stepped off the bus at the Savannah station, the thick, humid southern air hit me heavy with the scent of tidal mud and blooming jasmine. It was home. But for the first time in my life, home felt empty. I walked into my small frame house on East 37th Street. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The unwashed coffee mug in the sink, the Tuesday edition of the Savannah Morning News on the counter, the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. For 32 years, that house had been loud with the sounds of a growing boy, slammed doors, muddy boots, the scratching of charcoal on paper bags. Now the silence was absolute. 3 weeks passed in a dull gray blur. I didn't call Marcus, and Marcus, wrapped up in his glittering new reality, didn't call me. The only updates I received were digital crumbs tossed from a high table. One evening my phone buzzed with a notification. Valerie had posted a photograph on Facebook. I sat at my kitchen table, my calloused thumb hovering over the glass screen. The image showed a pristine, sunlit nursery that looked like it belonged in an Architectural Digest magazine, all muted beige tones, expensive Scandinavian wood, and white linen. Valerie was sitting in a rocker that probably cost more than my 3 months of groceries, looking radiant, her hair flowing in perfect, loose curls. Marcus stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, wearing a new linen shirt, smiling that wide, practiced New York smile. In Valerie's arms lay a tiny bundle wrapped in a white cashmere blanket. The caption read, "Welcome to the world, Matthew Vance. Born into love, elegance, and absolute peace, surrounded by the family that matters most. Thank you, Dr. Evelyn Thomas, for holding our hands through every step." I zoomed in on the baby's face. Even through a pixelated screen, I could see the Vance nose, that high, stubborn bridge that both Marcus and his father carried. My chest tightened with a physical, suffocating ache. I wanted to touch that cheek. I wanted to wrap him in the bright oranges and deep blues of the quilt currently sitting in a cedar chest in my hallway. I scrolled down to the comments. There were hundreds of them. High society friends, Ivy League colleagues, all praising the beautiful family. And there, right at the top, was Evelyn's comment, "A perfect legacy for a perfect child. Only the best for our boy." My thumb trembled. I wanted to type something. "Grandma Ruby loves you from Georgia." I wanted to assert my existence to remind the world that half the blood running through that child's veins came from the night shifts of a Savannah CNA. But I stopped myself. I deleted the draft. I locked the phone and set it face down on the linoleum. Sometimes, Ruby, I told myself, echoing the words of my own mother, silence is the only dignity they can't take away from you. On the 4th week, the silence was shattered. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The sky over Savannah was a dark, bruising purple, and the rain was drumming a steady, melancholy beat against the tin roof of my porch. I was sitting on the sofa mending an old cardigan when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar 212 area code, New York City. My heart did a foolish little dance. Marcus, I thought. He's calling to apologize. The boy finally woke up. I flipped the phone open. "Hello, Marcus. Is this Ruby Vance?" The voice on the other end wasn't my son's. It was a woman's voice, sharp nasal, completely devoid of warmth, operating on the high-efficiency frequency of a machine. "Yes, this is she. Who is calling, please?" "Mrs. Vance, my name is Linda Hayes. I am calling from the Patient Financial Services Division of the St. Luke's Medical Group in conjunction with Apex Recovery Solutions. We are calling regarding an outstanding balance on account number 884, Delta Marcus Vance." I lowered my knitting needles, my brow furrowing. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you must have the wrong number. My son Marcus works in New York, but his medical bills have nothing to do with me. He has insurance through his firm." A brief, heavy silence on the line, followed by the sound of rapid typing on a mechanical keyboard. The insurance provider Blue Cross Elite covered 90% of the standard delivery charges, Mrs. Vance. The woman explained, her tone dropping into that rehearsed, patronizing drone used by people who deal with debt all day. However, the patient Valerie Thomas Vance was admitted to the Executive Grand Suite on the International Pavilion, an out-of-network luxury tier. There were also elective specialized neonatal consultations and premium postpartum care amenities requested by the family. The remaining out-of-pocket balance is exactly $14,852. Well, that's a very large number, ma'am, I said, my voice remaining calm and measured. But as I said, that is between my son and his wife. I live in Georgia. I was not a patient there. Mrs. Vance, you are listed on the digital intake ledger as the secondary financial guarantor. The woman stated her words, dropping like small frozen pebbles into the conversation. When the patient was admitted under emergency distress, Mr. Marcus Vance executed an electronic signature linking an active line of credit previously established under your name, specifically the joint Capital One account, ending in 4412. Because the primary account holder has defaulted on the 30-day payment window, the debt has been escalated to collections. If this balance is not resolved within 48 hours, we will begin legal reporting procedures that will severely impact your personal credit score and place a lien on any linked assets. The room grew very cold. The sound of the rain on the tin roof suddenly felt incredibly loud, like a handful of gravel being thrown against the glass. The Capital One account ending in 4412. My mind flashed back 3 years. It was the account I had opened with Marcus when he first moved to Brooklyn. He didn't have a credit history in New York, and the landlord of that tiny studio apartment wouldn't let him sign the lease without a co-signer. I had put my name on that card, telling him it was only for emergencies, for when the winter utility bills got too high, or when he needed a train ticket home. I had forgotten the account even existed after he married into the Thomas wealth. Marcus hadn't just forgotten to take my name off the account. When he was backed into a financial corner in that luxury hospital wing under the demanding aristocratic eyes of his mother-in-law, he had looked at the intake form, looked at the $14,000 bill, and instead of asking the wealthy Thomas family for help, he had signed my name. He had used his mother's lifetime of clean credit as a human shield to protect his own pride. "Mrs. Vance, are you still there?" the debt collector asked briskly. "Can we process a debit payment for the minimum amount of $5,000 today to freeze the escalation?" I took a long, slow breath, closing my eyes. I felt the ghost of every floor I had ever mopped rising up through the soles of my shoes. I thought of the 16 hours on that bus. I thought of the way Marcus had looked at my shoes in the lobby. "No, ma'am," I said, my voice completely steady, dropping into that deep, immovable timbre of a true Southern matriarch. "You cannot process a payment. Mrs. Vance, I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. This will ruin your credit score. At your age, an escalation of this magnitude, I understand the gravity perfectly, Miss Hayes." I cut her off, my tone as sharp as a surgical blade. "But you have a fraudulent signature on your electronic ledger. I did not authorize that charge. I was not permitted past the ground floor lobby of your hospital. I am going to hang up this phone. I am going to call my attorney here in Chatham County, and I am going to file a formal dispute for unauthorized identity utilization. You tell my son that if he wants that bill paid, he can find the money in the pockets of his wife's cashmere coat." I slammed the phone shut before she could utter another syllable. My hands were shaking, a hot electric current of pure fury racing through my veins. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time the screen flashed with a name I hadn't seen in a month, Marcus. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 5th ring, I flipped it open and held it to my ear. I didn't say a word. I just listened to the breathing on the other end. "Ma." Marcus's voice sounded tight, high-pitched, vibrating with a frantic, aggressive energy. "Ma, what did you just do? I just got an automated alert from the bank. You put a fraud freeze on the Capital One card. Are you serious right now?" "Good afternoon to you too, Marcus," I said softly. "Ma, don't do this. Don't play these passive-aggressive Southern games with me, he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of panic and anger. The hospital finance office just called Valerie's cell phone. They said you threatened legal action. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is? Valerie is mortified. Her mother was right there when the call came in. Oh, so Dr. Evelyn was there? I asked, leaning back against the sofa, my voice dangerously calm. Did she enjoy her espresso while they discussed the bill? Ma, listen to me. Marcus' tone shifted, trying to adopt that firm, authoritative language he used with his junior architects. It was an emergency, okay. Valerie had a complication. The standard rooms were full of noise, and her blood pressure was going through the roof. Evelyn said we needed the international suite for her mental health. The hospital needed a secondary guarantor card on file immediately to clear the transfer. I didn't have time to call you and explain the whole system. You had time to walk down the elevator and tell me to leave the quilt, Marcus. I said each word independent and heavy as stone. You had 45 minutes while I sat by that ficus tree to tell me you were using my name to buy your wife a luxury room. It's just a temporary ledger entry, Ma. I was going to transfer the balance to my firm's bonus account next month. He lied, his voice thin and desperate. But because you froze the card, the bank flagged it as identity theft. They're threatening to audit the electronic signature. If my firm finds out I'm involved in a credit dispute with my own mother, it could ruin my track record. It could ruin everything I've built up here. Then you should have thought about your track record before you treated your mother like an ATM, son. Gia đình phải giúp nhau lúc khó khăn mà. Đó chính là những gì bố luôn nói. Marcus screamed into the phone, using his dead father's memory like a weapon. Bố luôn bảo chúng ta là một pháo đài. Vậy mà giờ đây chỉ vì mẹ tự ái, chỉ vì mẹ dân dối chuyện ở bệnh viện, mẹ sẵn sàng hủy hoại tương lai của con trai mình sao? Mẹ ích kỷ vừa thôi chứ. The word hung in the damp air of my living room like a foul odor. Selfish. The woman who had eaten day-old bread for 5 years so he could have pocket money at Howard University. The woman who had deferred her own dental work until her teeth cracked so he could buy the software for his architecture classes. I was selfish because I refused to let him steal my dignity to pay for his mother-in-law's lifestyle. Marcus, I said, and the sheer quietness of my voice made him stop shouting on the other end. Your father was a man who worked the docks until his heart literally burst in his chest. He never signed another person's name to a piece of paper in his life. He paid for what he could afford, and what he couldn't afford he walked away from with his head held high. Ma, this is New York. No, Marcus, this is about manhood. I interrupted him, my voice rising with a slow, terrifying authority. You wanted to live in a glass conservatory in Central Park. You wanted a wife who looks down her nose at the soil of Georgia. You wanted a mother-in-law who treats your own mother like a kitchen maid. You chose that family, Marcus. You stood in that lobby, and you looked me in the eye, and you told me that they were the family that mattered. Well, if they are the elite, let them pay the elite bills. I am locking my credit. I am filing the dispute. And if the bank calls you for an audit, you better tell them the truth. Ma, if you do this, Valerie and her mother will never let you see Matthew. You'll never hold this baby, I swear to God. That was his final card, the ultimate leverage. He thought the hunger for my grandbaby would make me weak. He thought I would crawl on my knees and hand over my hard-earned savings just for a glimpse of that little boy's face. I looked out the window at the rain pouring down on my small garden. I felt a tear finally slip down my cheek, hot and bitter, but my jaw stayed set. Marcus, I said, my voice cracking slightly but remaining unbroken. I love that little boy with every piece of my soul. But I will not buy my way into my grandson's life with $14,000 and a broken spine. If you teach your son that his grandmother is something to be used and thrown away, then that is the curse you will have to carry on your own conscience. Goodbye, Marcus. I didn't wait for his reply. I flipped the phone shut. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely function. I walked into the kitchen, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I sat down at the linoleum table and I did something I hadn't done since the day Big Marcus died. I put my face in my rough hands and I let the sorrow wash over me. I wept for the boy who used to draw bridges on paper bags. I wept for the teenager who promised me a wraparound porch. That boy was dead. The city had taken him, the wealth had swallowed him, and the Thomas family had hollowed him out until there was nothing left but a cowardly shadow. An hour later, my computer dinged with a new email. I opened the old desktop monitor in the corner of the kitchen. The email was from Marcus. It wasn't a message of regret. It was a formal, icy document, obviously drafted under the supervision of Dr. Evelyn Thomas. Ruby, since you have chosen to prioritize your financial spite over the well-being of your son, your daughter-in-law, and your newborn grandson, we are establishing formal boundaries. Your refusal to cooperate with the hospital administration has caused severe distress to Valerie during a critical postpartum recovery window. As a result, we are suspending all contact. Do not call this number. Do not travel to New York. If you attempt to contact Valerie or enter the property of Dr. Evelyn Thomas, we will involve legal counsel to establish a protective order. You have chosen your path. We have chosen ours. Marcus Vance. I read it once. I read it twice. The third time I didn't feel the pain anymore. The tissue had gone numb. I stood up, walked over to the front door, and took my keys off the hook. I drove down to the local branch of the Savannah Federal Credit Union. I sat with a young black woman named Alicia, who used to attend my church's Sunday school. With her help, I formally filed the identity utilization dispute, froze my credit scores across all 3 American bureaus, and moved my modest retirement savings into a private protected trust account that required a 2-factor physical signature to access. When I walked out of the bank, the rain had stopped. The sun was breaking through the heavy purple clouds, catching the water droplets on the Spanish moss, making the trees look like they were covered in millions of tiny diamonds. The air was clean. It was fresh. I drove home, went into the hallway, and opened the cedar chest. I took out the bright patchwork quilt. I held it to my nose, breathing in the scent of cedar and dried lavender. Marcus thought he had locked me in a prison of loneliness. He thought his silence would break me. But as I laid that quilt carefully back into the dark, I realized something important. I had survived the night shifts. I had survived the grief of a young widowhood. I had built a man out of nothing but my own sweat and the grace of God. If that man chose to break himself against the rocks of vanity, I could not stop him. But I would be damned if I let him drag his mother down into the surf with him. I went out onto my front porch, sat down in my old wicker rocking chair, and watched the evening sun sink below the Savannah horizon. The silence was still there, but it didn't feel like loneliness anymore. It felt like a fortress. Here is the complete and unabridged Part 3 of your script continuing the story of Ruby Vance. This section chronicles the gradual, realistic collapse of Marcus and Valerie's New York life building toward the emotional turning point where the consequences of their choices finally catch up with them. There is a particular kind of rot that settles into a house when its foundations are built on vanity. It doesn't start with a sudden crash. It starts quietly in the dark corners where the moisture seeps into the wood and the wood slowly turns to mush. You don't know the floorboards are gone until your foot goes right through them. For 18 months, I watched that rot happen from 800 miles away. I didn't seek it out. I didn't spy on my son, nor did I break the boundary of silence I had drawn in the red dirt of Georgia. But in the modern world, a mother doesn't need to ask questions to see her child drowning. The internet is a cruel mirror, and Valerie Thomas Vance could not stop herself from holding her life up to it, desperate to prove that the glass was still flawless. At first, the digital facade remained pristine. On Matthew's 6-month milestone, there was a photograph of the boy dressed in a miniature designer linen suit, sitting on a velvet sofa in their Manhattan apartment. Dr. Evelyn Thomas sat to his left, her posture as rigid and academic as a marble statue wearing a diamond brooch that caught the studio lighting. Marcus was always in the background, a handsome accessory looking slightly thinner each month, his shoulders dropping just an inch lower in every frame. But by the 9th month, the texture of the images began to shift. The sunlit, high-ceilinged Manhattan apartment disappeared from Valerie's profile. The backdrops became darker, the ceilings lower, the furniture heavier and more oppressive. I recognized that furniture. It was the dark antique mahogany of Evelyn's brownstone in Harlem. Marcus and Valerie had moved. The public caption read, "Embracing the beauty of multi-generational living, we've decided to consolidate our spaces to give Matthew a richer cultural environment under the wisdom of Dr. Evelyn Thomas." It takes a village. I sat at my kitchen table in Savannah, the morning light cutting through my blinds, and I shook my head. A village number Marcus had a village in Georgia. He had aunties who would have carried that baby on their hips while I cooked supper. He had old men from the church who would have taught him how to fish the salt marshes for blue crab. Marcus hadn't moved into a village. He had retreated into a fortress. And judging by the forced, tight smiles on his face, he was a prisoner, not a resident. The truth of what was happening in New York didn't come from social media. It came from the American economy, a cold, unyielding beast that doesn't care about elite family lineages or tenured sociology professors. By the end of 2025, the commercial real estate market in Manhattan had hit a historic wall. Tech firms were downsizing high-rise construction projects, were freezing mid-frame, and the mid-tier architectural firms were the first to bleed out. Marcus's company, the one that had bought him those tailored suits and made him feel like he had outgrown his mother's scrub brushes, laid off 30% of its junior partners in a single Tuesday morning sweep. I learned about it through a mutual acquaintance, old Mr. Henderson, whose nephew worked as a draftsman in Brooklyn. Ruby Henderson had told me over the fence while I was watering my collard greens. "Marcus is out of work, sister. My nephew says they cleared his desk out before noon. He's been doing freelance consulting, but the city is dry right now." My heart broke for my boy in that instant. Every maternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to pick up the phone, to dial his number, to tell him I had $3,000 tucked away in the sugar jar, and that his old bedroom on East 37th Street still had clean sheets on the mattress. But I forced my hands to stay down. "If you carry him now, Ruby," a quiet voice inside me whispered, "he will never learn how to stand on his own spine. He has to feel the cold floor he chose to sleep on." What Marcus was experiencing in that Harlem brownstone wasn't just financial hardship. It was a slow, systematic execution of his dignity. In the Thomas household, wealth wasn't just currency, it was the measure of human worth. A black man from the South was tolerated as long as he was a rising star, a trophy to be displayed at cocktail parties, as proof of Valerie's modern progressive taste. But an unemployed son-in-law, a man who couldn't pay his share of the luxury infant care or the brownstone's steep maintenance fees, he became a ghost in his own life. Dr. Evelyn Thomas did not hide her contempt. I could imagine her voice sharp and precise as a scalpel cutting through the silence of the dinner table. "Marcus, darling, it's quite fascinating how your regional background prepared you for economic instability. In our family, we are accustomed to intellectual and institutional longevity. Perhaps you could look into municipal drafting work. The city always needs people to draw utility lines." And Valerie, trapped in the suffocating cage of her mother's expectations, didn't defend her husband. She had been raised to believe that appearance was everything. Marcus's unemployment wasn't just a financial crisis for her. It was a public humiliation. She began to spiral. The pressure of being the perfect mother, the perfect daughter of an elite academic, and the wife of a failed man crushed her from the inside out. The photographs on Facebook stopped completely by the time Matthew turned 14 months old. The silence that followed was heavy, dark, and thick with latent disaster. The disaster officially arrived on a scorching Thursday afternoon in June. The Georgia heat was so thick you could almost slice it with a butter knife. I was in my kitchen, standing over a heavy cast-iron pot, stirring a low, slow batch of okra soup. The steam was rising into my face, smelling of smoked turkey and fresh tomatoes, when my telephone rang. I wiped my brow with an old dish towel and picked up the receiver. "Hello. Is this Mrs. Ruby Vance of Savannah, Georgia?" The voice was professional, but unlike the debt collector from 18 months ago, this tone carried a distinct weight of bureaucratic gravity. It was the voice of a woman who spent her days dealing with human wreckage. "Yes, this is Ruby Vance. Who am I speaking with?" "Mrs. Vance, my name is Detective Sergeant Sarah Jenkins. I am calling from the Special Victims and Family Services Division of the New York Police Department, currently operating in conjunction with the Department of Social Services at Bellevue Hospital." My hand froze on the wooden spoon. The kitchen, the heat, the smell of the okra, everything seemed to turn to ice in an instant. My knees felt hollow. I grabbed the edge of the counter to keep my balance. "My son," I whispered, my voice dropping into that dark, terrifying place where a mother's worst fears live. "Marcus, is my boy dead?" "No, Mrs. Vance. Mr. Marcus Vance is alive. He is currently at Bellevue Hospital," the detective said quickly, sensing the panic in my throat. "But we have a severe domestic and psychological crisis involving his family. Your daughter-in-law, Valerie Thomas Vance, suffered an acute psychological break 48 hours ago, what the medical staff is classifying as severe postpartum psychosis with catatonic features. She is currently committed under an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold." I took a ragged breath, my heart pounding like a trapped bird against my ribs. "And Marcus, what about my grandbaby? What about Matthew?" A heavy sigh came through the receiver. "Mr. Vance is physically unharmed, but he is in a state of severe psychological shock and exhaustion. He has been evaluated by our crisis team and deemed temporarily incapable of providing adequate safe care for the child due to acute situational depression and sleep deprivation. He has refused food for 2 days. The detective paused the sound of papers rustling on her end. "Mrs. Vance, we are currently holding 18-month-old Matthew Vance at a temporary emergency transition center under the jurisdiction of Child Protective Services. We contacted the child's maternal grandmother, Dr. Evelyn Thomas, yesterday morning, as she was the primary local contact listed on the grid." "And what did Evelyn say?" I asked, my voice tightening as a cold, familiar anger began to override my panic. "Dr. Thomas refused to take custody of the child," Detective Jenkins said, her tone dropping its professional neutrality for just a fraction of a second, revealing a deep systemic disgust. She stated through her legal counsel that her daughter's condition was exacerbated by the domestic environment and that she could not accept the liability or the public disruption of having an infant in her home during the university's summer administrative session. She signed a formal waiver allowing the state to place the child in temporary foster care pending a family court evaluation. She signed a waiver, the grand elegant Dr. Evelyn Thomas, the woman who had corporate lawyers and tenured chairs, the woman who had looked at my orthopedic shoes and saw an uncultivated country woman. When the storm hit her family, when the polished glass conservatory shattered, she didn't pick up the pieces. She didn't hold her grandson's hand. She signed a legal document to hand a Vance baby over to the state of New York because an 18-month-old child was a public disruption to her academic schedule. "Mrs. Vance," the detective continued, her voice softening, "we found your name and address in a notebook inside Mr. Vance's briefcase. He had written your number down on a page titled "In Case of Total Default," but he had crossed it out several times. When we asked him if we should call you, he just closed his eyes and wouldn't speak. But according to New York State guidelines, before we place a child into the public foster network, we must exhaust all verified biological kin. Can you come to New York, Mrs. Vance? If you cannot be here by tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, we will have no choice but to place Matthew into a residential facility." I looked down at my hands. Those rough, calloused CNA hands that had spent 20 years cleaning up the messes that other people were too proud or too soft to handle. I looked around my clean, quiet kitchen. I had spent 18 months building a fortress of peace in this house. I had achieved comfort. I had achieved safety. And now the city that had stolen my son was calling me to come clean up its garbage. "Detective Jenkins," I said, my voice completely clear, completely devoid of any hesitation. "What is the address of that transition center?" "It's the clinic on East 29th Street, ma'am, near the hospital pavilion. You tell your people to hold on to that baby." I said my words coming out with the weight of an iron anchor. "I am going to change my clothes. I am going to lock my front door, and I am going to get on the evening flight out of Savannah Hilton Head. I will be standing in your office by 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Do not let anyone touch my grandson." I didn't take the Greyhound this time. This wasn't a journey of hope. This was a military operation. I paid $400 money I had earned from selling my homemade elderberry syrups and mending dresses for the ladies in the neighborhood for a last-minute ticket on a Delta flight to JFK. I wore my best black Sunday suit. I pressed the collar until it was as sharp as a razor. I didn't bring a large suitcase, just a small overnight bag, and draped over my shoulder the heavy orange, blue, and yellow patchwork quilt. I held that quilt through the entire flight, my fingers tracing the squares of denim from Marcus's old overalls. When the plane landed in New York, the sun wasn't even up yet. The sky was a pale, sickly lavender, and the air coming off the tarmac was thick with the humid metallic stench of the city. I caught a cab straight to the Department of Social Services facility on East 29th Street. The building was a grim brick structure with reinforced glass windows and a security guard who looked like he hadn't slept since the previous administration. I sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room for 45 minutes, the quilt in my lap, my eyes fixed on the gray linoleum floor. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the heavy security door at the back of the room clicked open. Detective Jenkins, a tired-looking white woman with a sharp ponytail and a badge clipped to her belt, stepped out, followed by a social worker carrying a clipboard. "Ruby Vance?" the detective asked. I stood up, pulling myself up to my full height, my shoulders back, the quilt draped over my forearm like a royal mantle. "Yes, ma'am. I am here for my grandson." The social worker looked at my black suit, looked at my graying hair, and then looked down at her clipboard. "Mrs. Vance, we have the temporary emergency custody transfer documents ready. Mr. Marcus Vance has signed his consent from the Bellevue Observation Wing. But I must inform you the child has been through a significant trauma. He has been nonverbal for 48 hours, and he is exhibiting severe stranger anxiety." "He doesn't know strangers, miss," I said softly. "He knows his blood." They led me through a series of locked doors into a small, sterile playroom. The room smelled of old plastic and industrial pine cleaner. There were a few broken plastic trucks scattered on a faded foam mat in the corner. And there, sitting in the very corner of the room, wedged between a plastic toy chest and the wall, was Matthew. My heart didn't just break. It became a liquid fire. The boy was wearing a dirty, oversized t-shirt that didn't belong to him. His beautiful curly hair was matted with dried sweat, and his cheeks were streaked with gray tracks where his tears had dried into the city dust. He was holding a small plastic car, his knuckles white, his tiny jaw clenched so hard his lips were blue. He was staring at the floor, his entire body shivering in the air-conditioned chill of the room. The social worker stepped forward. "Matthew, look who's here." The moment her voice cut through the room, the boy let out a shrill, terrifying scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, and buried his face into the corner of the wall, kicking his little legs out in a desperate defensive frenzy. "As I said, Mrs. Vance," the social worker muttered, stepping back with a sigh. "He's highly reactive right now. It might be better if we sedate him slightly for the transport." "Move out of my way, child," I said, my voice low and authoritative. I walked past her. I didn't rush. I didn't make any sudden movements. I walked across that gray linoleum floor until I was 5 feet away from the foam mat. Then, with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who had spent 20 years approaching the bedsides of frightened, dying people, I sank down onto my knees. My 62-year-old joints popped against the hard floor, but I didn't care. I unrolled the patchwork quilt. I spread it out over my lap, letting the bright, vibrant oranges and deep, comforting southern blues spill across the gray room like a sunrise. Then I began to hum. I didn't sing words. Words are too sharp for a broken baby. I just hummed an old low-register melody from the First African Baptist Church back in Savannah, the same song I used to hum to Marcus 32 years ago, when the thunder would shake our small windows on the coast. It was a heavy, vibrating sound that came from deep within my chest, a sound that carried the frequency of safety, of survival of soil that had been baked by the sun. Matthew's screaming stopped. Slowly, carefully, he turned his little head. His wide amber eyes, swollen and red from crying, looked out from behind his tiny shoulder. He looked at the bright orange fabric. He looked at the navy blue denim square. And then his eyes traveled up to my face. I didn't reach out for him. I didn't force myself into his space. I just stayed on my knees, humming that low, steady song, my face open, my hands resting palms up on the vibrant cotton of the quilt. For 2 long minutes, the only sound in that sterile New York office was the humming of an old black woman from Georgia. Then Matthew let out a soft, ragged sob. He dropped the plastic car. He crawled out from the narrow space behind the toy chest, his little hands dragging across the foam mat until he reached the edge of my quilt. He crawled onto the fabric, his small, dirty knees sinking into the soft cotton, and then he collapsed forward, burying his wet face right into the center of my chest. His tiny fingers locked into the lapel of my black Sunday suit with a desperate iron grip, his whole body shaking as the real tears finally came soft, quiet, healing tears. I brought my arms around him then. I wrapped that heavy quilt around his small back, sealing him away from the city, away from the Bellevue observation wings, away from the toxic luxury of the Thomas family. I pulled him close against my neck, breathing in the scent of him, the sour smell of fear mixed with the sweet, undeniable scent of my own blood. I stood up from that floor carrying the full weight of my grandson in my arms. I turned to the social worker who was staring at us with her mouth slightly open, her clipboard forgotten in her lap. "Give me the papers," I said, my voice like iron. "I am taking my boy home." The walk from the transition center to the secure observation wing of Bellevue Hospital felt like carrying a mountain up a flight of stairs. Matthew was fast asleep against my shoulder, his small body heavy with the absolute exhaustion that comes after a child has fought terror for 48 hours. I kept the patchwork quilt wrapped tight around him, shielding his head from the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the hospital corridors. I didn't look like a woman who had just stepped off a midnight flight. My black Sunday suit was crisp, my jaw was set, and my eyes were clear. In my 22 years as a CNA, I had seen every manner of human collapse. Wealthy men reduced to whimpering babies by pain, proud women broken by the slow theft of dementia. I knew that the only way to handle a crisis is to become the absolute center of gravity in the room. You don't let the chaos dictate the rhythm. You make the chaos bend to your stride. When I pushed through the heavy double doors of the acute psychiatric observation ward, the first thing I saw was my son. Marcus was sitting on a low vinyl bench outside room 402. He looked like an old coat that had been dropped in the mud and stepped on. His expensive New York overcoat was gone, replaced by a thin, wrinkled hospital gown thrown over his undershirt. His hair, usually cut with razor-sharp precision, was wildly disheveled, and his face was gray, that sickly ash-colored hue that settles into black skin when the spirit has completely given up the ghost. When the sound of my sensible orthotic shoes echoed against the linoleum, his head snapped up. He looked at me, then his eyes traveled down to the vibrant orange and navy blue quilt cradled in my arms and then up to my face again. He didn't speak. He just let out a low, ragged sound from the back of his throat, a sound like a dying animal, and buried his face in his hands. His long, elegant hands, the hands of an architect, were shaking so hard he could barely keep them against his skin. "Ma." He choked out his voice, thin-cracked and completely hollow. "Ma, you came." I stood over him, my shadow falling across his slumped shoulders. I didn't drop my bag. I didn't lean down to hug him. I didn't offer him the easy, soft comfort he had spent his whole life expecting from me. "I didn't come for you, Marcus," I said, my voice quiet, dropping into that deep, heavy register that left no room for negotiation. "I came for Big Marcus's grandson. I came because a Vance baby belongs to the soil, not to a state filing cabinet. Now sit up and look at your mother." Slowly, his hand slipped down his face. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and swimming with a desperate childlike terror. They took everything, Ma. The firm went under in April. The apartment. I couldn't make the balloon payment on the Manhattan lease. I lost the equity. Every single dollar we had from the wedding gifts, my savings, the money you gave me. It's all gone. We've been living in Evelyn's basement for 3 months. He choked on the name, his shoulders convulsing. "Evelyn? She wouldn't even let me use the front door, Ma. She made me carry the stroller through the service alley because she didn't want the neighbors to see her son-in-law looking like a vagrant. And Valerie couldn't take it. The pressure. The screaming. Where is she, Marcus?" I cut him off. He pointed a trembling finger toward the small glass window of room 402. I shifted Matthew carefully to my left hip, keeping him anchored against my heart, and stepped up to the glass. Inside the room, the walls were bare, padded with soft, pale vinyl. Valerie was sitting on the edge of a low, frameless bed. She wasn't wearing her designer linen or her diamond necklaces. She was in a heavy anti-suicide smock. Her beautiful curls were tangled, her amber eyes wide, vacant, staring fixedly at a single point on the opposite wall, as if she were watching a ghost that nobody else could see. She looked completely hollowed out, like a beautiful house that had been completely gutted by fire from the inside, leaving only the scorched brick standing. "The doctors say it's a severe manic breakdown with catatonic features," Marcus whispered behind me, his voice trembling. "She started scrubbing the basement floor at 3 a.m. with pure lie ma. She was screaming that the baby was dirty, that her mother could smell the Georgia dirt on him. She wouldn't let me touch him. When I tried to take the lie away, she shattered a mirror and tried to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He just slid off the bench, his knees hitting the cold floor, his head leaning against my thigh as he wept loud, ugly, desperate sobs that filled the sterile corridor. I looked down at him. 1.5 years ago, this man had stood in a hospital lobby and told me that my presence was a distraction. He had signed my name to a $14,000 debt to buy a luxury room to impress a woman who didn't even know his grandmother's middle name. He had allowed me to be pushed out into the New York winter like an old piece of trash. But as I looked at the crown of his head, at the stubborn curl of his hair that looked exactly like his father's, the anger didn't rise, only a deep, heavy sadness. "Get up off that floor, Marcus Vance," I said softly, but with a command that made his crying stop. A Vance man does not beg on his knees in front of strangers. "Stand up." He swallowed his tears, using the edge of the vinyl bench to pull himself to his feet. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, looking at me like a dog waiting for a blow. "I am taking Matthew back to Savannah on the evening flight," I told him, my eyes locked on his gray face. "The social worker has already signed the emergency kinship transfer. He is going to sleep in your old room. He is going to eat fresh fruit from the tree in my yard, and he is going to learn what peace smells like. You are going to stay here. You are going to wash your face. You are going to put on real clothes, and you are going to stand by that girl in that room until the doctors say she can walk out of those doors." "Ma, she hates you," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden protective panic. She was the one who told me to cross your name off the list. She said your southern ways would ruin the child's development. She didn't say that, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping into a chilly, razor-sharp certainty. "Evelyn said that, and your wife was too terrified of her mother to speak her own mind. Now stay here." I didn't wait for his permission. I turned the handle of room 402 and stepped inside, closing the heavy insulated door behind me. The room was silent, save for the low, monotonous hum of the hidden ventilation unit. The air smelled of heavy sedative medication and old sweat. When the door clicked shut, Valerie didn't move. Her head stayed locked toward the wall, her amber eyes wide and glassy, her fingers twitching rhythmically against the rough fabric of her smock. I walked over slowly, the heavy quilt draped over my arm, Matthew sleeping soundly against my shoulder. I didn't speak. I didn't scold her. I just sat down on the very edge of the low bed about 2 feet away from her. For 5 minutes, we just sat there in the silence. 2 women, 2 mothers. One who had survived the fire, and one who was currently burning to ash in the center of it. Then, without looking at me, Valerie's lips moved. Her voice didn't sound like the proud, aristocratic interior designer from the glass conservatory. It sounded like a child speaking from the bottom of a deep, dark well. "She's going to take him," Valerie whispered. Her breath was short, ragged. "She's going to take Matthew. She told the doctors I am genetically deficient. She told Marcus that our marriage was an unfortunate cultural experiment that has reached its logical conclusion. She's going to put him in a school in New England where I can never see him. Because I'm dirty. Because I couldn't keep the house clean." I reached out then. I didn't touch her skin, she was too raw for that. Instead, I unfolded the corner of the patchwork quilt, the bright orange and mustard yellow fabric, and I laid it gently across her trembling knees. Twist 3. Valerie's head slowly turned. Her amber eyes, bloodshot and frantic, looked down at the hand-stitched cotton. And then a tremor shook her entire frame. A sound came out of her, not an angry scream, but a long, weeping wail of pure historical grief. My mother never held me." "Ruby?" Valerie whispered, her face collapsing, the tears finally breaking through the catatonic glaze pouring down her cheeks in a muddy torrent. She used to lock me in the dark pantry when I was 3 years old if I spilled my milk. She told me that if I wasn't perfect, if I didn't get into Columbia, if I didn't marry someone she could control, that I was nothing, just a piece of trash from the gutter. She looked at me, her fingers clawing into the bright orange fabric of my quilt, her face twisted in a mask of absolute agony. I was so scared of her, Ruby. When Marcus said he wanted you to come to the hospital, Evelyn went crazy. She said if that country woman came into the room with her old-fashioned, unscientific ways, she would cut off my inheritance. She would evict us from the brownstone. She would tell the entire board at Columbia that I was insane. I made Marcus choose. I made him choose between you and my mother. Because I was a coward. I was so scared she would lock me in the dark again. She slumped forward then, her head dropping onto my lap right next to the sleeping form of her son, her fingers clutching at my black Sunday suit. I'm so sorry, Ruby. I'm so sorry. Please don't let her take my baby. Please don't let her turn him into an artifact. I looked down at the girl, the elite, the high society designer. She wasn't my enemy. She wasn't a monster. She was just another broken child who had been raised in a house without a soul. A child who had been taught that love was something you had to buy with perfection, or else be cast out into the cold. I raised my rough, calloused hand, the hand that had spent 20 years holding the dying, and I placed it gently on the back of Valerie's tangled hair. Hush now, child. I whispered, the low, heavy rhythm of Georgia returning to my voice. The dark is over. Nobody is taking this baby. Evelyn Thomas has already signed the waiver. She gave this child to the state because he was too loud for her summer schedule. Valerie's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a sudden desperate realization. She gave him away. She tried to... I said, my jaw tightening into an iron line. But she forgot one thing. A Vance baby doesn't belong to the state of New York. He belongs to me. Now you listen to me, Valerie. You rest. You take the medicine these doctors give you. You let your mind heal. Because when you walk out of these doors, you and Marcus are not going back to that basement in Harlem. You are coming south. And we are going to build a new house on real soil where nobody has to be perfect to be loved. Valerie closed her eyes, her breathing finally slowing down, her head resting against my knee as the heavy sedative began to pull her under. She fell asleep right there, her hand still holding tight to a square of navy blue denim from my son's old overalls. I stood up from the bed carrying Matthew and walked out into the corridor. Marcus was standing there, his face pale, waiting. "Ma," he whispered. "She's asleep," I said, walking past him toward the elevator doors. "I'm heading to the airport with the baby. You stay here and keep watch. And Marcus, if Evelyn Thomas shows her face in this hallway before I get back, you tell her that Ruby Vance is currently holding the ledger, and the balance is due." The final reckoning did not take place in a courtroom, nor did it happen beneath the moss-draped oak trees of Savannah. It happened right there on the 4th floor of Bellevue Hospital 12 hours later, when the morning sun finally broke through the heavy smog of Manhattan. I had sent Marcus to the cafeteria to wash his face and put on a clean shirt. I was sitting on the vinyl bench outside Valerie's room, Matthew cradled asleep in my arms under the patchwork quilt, when the elevator doors at the end of the hall dinged with a sharp, aggressive clarity. Step, step, step. The sound of those expensive designer leather pumps was unmistakable. Dr. Evelyn Thomas walked down the corridor like a general reviewing a defeated army. Her camel-colored trench coat was unbuttoned, revealing a crisp Chanel suit beneath it. She carried a sleek black leather briefcase, and her face was a mask of cold academic detachment. She stopped exactly 3 feet away from my bench, looking down at me through her gold-rimmed glasses. "Ruby," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into that chilling, patronizing register. "I was informed by the hospital administration that you had interfered with the emergency social services transition. I must tell you this emotional impulsivity is highly counterproductive. Valerie is incapacitated and Marcus is completely destabilized. As the primary head of the maternal household, I have already instructed my legal counsel to execute a formal petition for institutional guardianship over Matthew. He will be placed in a private residential academy in Connecticut where his development can be scientifically managed." I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move an inch. I just looked up at her through the quiet, heavy eyes of a woman who had spent half her life watching people try to bargain with God at the edge of a hospital bed. "Evelyn," I said softly, the low rumble of Georgia cutting through the sterile air. "Sit down." "I will certainly not." I said, "Sit down, woman." I cut her off, my tone dropping an octave into an iron register that made her jaw instantly tighten. Slowly, reluctantly, her pride warring with her confusion, Evelyn sat on the far end of the vinyl bench. She kept her black briefcase between us like a wall. "You talk a lot about science and institutions, Evelyn," I said, looking down at the baby's sleeping face. "But you forgot that I spent 22 years keeping records in places just like this. Before I got on that plane last night, I had Detective Jenkins print out the official dispatch log from 48 hours ago. I also have the signed waiver you sent through your attorney to the Child Protective Services office." I turned my head, looking her straight in her cold amber eyes. "You signed a document stating that this 18-month-old child was a public disruption to your university schedule. You handed your own flesh and blood over to a state locker because you didn't want the neighbors in Harlem to see a crisis in your house." Evelyn's face flushed a deep mottled red. That was a strategic legal maneuver to protect the family's institutional standing. No, that was cowardice. I whispered each word sharp as a razor blade. Climax 2, and it's a matter of state record now. If you file for guardianship, I will take this log, I will take the medical records of how you locked your own daughter in a dark pantry until her mind broke, and I will hand them directly to the Board of Trustees at Columbia University. I will make sure every student, every dean, and every newspaper in New York knows exactly what kind of sociology you practice behind your closed doors. I have 20 years of unblemished service in healthcare, Evelyn. The courts will believe my hands long before they believe your degrees. Evelyn Thomas froze. For the first time in her life, the polished glass of her armor didn't just crack, it shattered into dust. Her lips trembled, her fingers gripping the leather of her briefcase so hard her knuckles turned white. She looked at the baby, then at the absolute, unyielding stone in my face, and she knew she had lost. A year and a half has passed since that cold morning in Bellevue. If you walk down East 37th Street in Savannah today past the old White House with the big pecan tree in the yard, you'll hear the sound of a child's laughter bouncing off the wooden porch. Marcus and Valerie do not live in a brownstone anymore. They rent a small sunlit cottage 3 doors down from my house. Marcus works as a senior draftsman for a local structural engineering firm in historic Savannah. It doesn't pay New York money, but it pays enough for fresh groceries and a peaceful night's sleep. His shoulders aren't stooped anymore. He walks with the heavy, grounded stride of a man who found his spine in the fire. Valerie spends her Tuesday and Thursday afternoons on my front porch, her hands no longer covered in the sharp scent of industrial lye. She sits with me, her fingers learning the slow, rhythmic geometry of the knitting needles. Her amber eyes are clear now, the catatonic gaze replaced by a soft, quiet peace. She's learning that in this family you don't have to be a masterpiece to stay inside the house. You just have to be real. And Matthew is nearly 4 years old now. He doesn't scream at the sight of strangers anymore. This morning the sun was rising over the coast, casting long golden fingers of light across my wooden floorboards. I was sitting in my wicker rocker, holding a warm cup of coffee, when the screen door banged open. "Grandma Ruby, Grandma Ruby." Matthew came tearing into the living room, his wild Vance curls bouncing his cheeks flushed with the morning air. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't check a list. He climbed right up into my lap, his little arms wrapping tight around my neck, burying his sweet face into the collar of my faded blue house dress. Behind him, Marcus and Valerie walked onto the porch hand in hand, carrying a basket of fresh peaches from the market. They looked at me, and they didn't look embarrassed. They looked at me with a deep, silent reverence. I pulled the orange, navy, and yellow patchwork quilt up over Matthew's legs, rocking him back and forth against my chest. I looked out at the green leaves of the pecan tree shifting in the warm southern breeze, and I felt a profound, immovable stillness settle into my soul. I had given everything. I had been broken. I had been pushed out into the winter. But I had stood my ground. I had drawn my ranch joy, and I had chosen myself when the world told me to disappear. Love doesn't mean enduring layout, I thought as my grandson fell asleep to the steady rhythmic beating of my heart. Love means boundaries, and the harvest of those boundaries is peace.